Heather Hager. Before we begin, there are a few housekeeping items to go over. Please note that all of your participant telephone and microphone connections will be muted throughout the webinar, but we do intend for this to be an interactive experience. So if you have questions, please use the questions box in your GoToWebinar window. And we'll also be recording it and providing a link to that recording, a copy of the slides, as well as a follow-up survey will be sent out regarding the webinar afterwards. So just a quick check, can you hear me now? You should be hearing me at this point, but for those who may not be yet on audio, I'm including this slide for instructions on how to connect. Also, you'll see on the left side, there's a sample GoToWebinar meeting pane, and that's where you'll find that questions portal. It's near the bottom of the window. Again, please feel free to submit your questions during the presentation, and if we can easily address it during the presentation, we will. But we'll definitely reserve some time at the end to ensure that we can get through as many of your questions as possible. During the webinar, we'll also ask for your participation in a series of polls, and those will appear on your screen between slides. Briefly, I did want to remind you of the KER mission, which is to support and promote high-quality undergraduate student-faculty collaborative research and scholarship. We're a national and an increasingly international organization of over 13,000 individuals and represent all disciplines in over 1,900 institutions of all types. I'm sorry, 900. Wouldn't it be great though if we had 1,900? The KER website is www.ker.org, and I hope that you'll go on and explore all of our various conferences, publications, and programs, which support at all different levels of faculty, administrators, and students. Our speaker today is Heather Hager. She is the Assessment Research Coordinator for KER, and she's also the Assessment and Educational Research Coordinator for California State University at Monterey Bay. She holds a PhD in Education Policy Studies and Practices. And with that brief introduction, I'll welcome Heather to the webinar and turn it over to her.
Thank you, Robin. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I would actually like to start with getting to know a little bit about what you're interested in as far as assessment. So we're going to start with a poll question about what is your goal in assessment and in attending this webinar. Is your primary goal thinking about reporting for grants or other funding agencies, or just about finding out what's working and not working in your own programs? Or are you thinking about how you can demonstrate the impact to campus leadership or other parties that might be interested in the effects of your program? Or are you really interested in generating new knowledge or practices and being able to publish those results? We'll give you a minute to answer and then we'll get started.
So with the early responses in, we are seeing that most of you are looking to demonstrate impact for campus leaders, followed closely behind by those that finding out what's working or not working on campus. I'll go ahead and close that out and share that with you so you can see a brief synopsis of the results.
Great, thank you. Well, perfect. So survey research can really be used to meet many of these different goals, but especially if you're looking at showing the impact of your program, this can be a great place to start. So today's agenda will be talking about using surveys to assess undergraduate research. So we'll talk a little bit about survey methods to begin with, uses and limitations, and then go over whether you're using pre-established surveys or creating your own. Some strategies for that, and then really how to do a successful survey administration, and then what to do with your results once you get them. So to get started, we're going to think about what do you actually assess. So the traditional model is to think about what you want to know. 79% of you are thinking about how you demonstrate the impact to leadership. That might be the question of what is the impact of our program? How do we measure that? And then you find or design a survey to answer those questions, and then find the population or your subjects that you need to survey. But in reality, this can happen in different ways. So you might start with a question, but you might also start with the survey. Maybe your institution already participates in a survey. Maybe there's previously collected data you can use. And so starting looking at that survey, you might then look at what questions can we answer with that? Who has already been surveyed? What can we already do with this data? So that's our next poll question, is to think about, do you have access to any previously collected information? So this could be maybe a national survey that your campus participates in, such as a student engagement survey, or maybe a campus-wide survey. My institution does a graduating senior survey, and so we've been able to use some of that information. Or has anyone done a specific survey of undergraduate research participants? Or course-based surveys that might include courses that involve undergraduate research, and maybe you could compare to other more traditional formatted courses. We'll give you another minute to finish answering these. And thinking about this at the start is important, because if you have data you can already use, you might not have to reinvent the wheel and spend a lot of time collecting new data. So thinking about what you have first is an important step. Okay, so it looks like a lot of people participate in a national survey, which is great. We'll talk about using those and how to use them and looking at undergraduate research. And then also some other surveys of undergraduate research participants. So that's great. So the reason I bring that up too is that's data you could start working with right now. And then as you're building surveys or finding other surveys to administer that are going to take longer, you might not have results until next term or next year. If you start with previously collected data, you can hit the ground running with that. But before we hit the ground running and collecting new data, we want to stop and check to see if you need Institutional Review Board or IRB approval. In looking at undergraduate research, it's often a gray area what falls under program evaluation and what falls under research. So you want to check with them early to make sure you get approval if you need it, or that you are sure that you're exempt from approval. And even if you don't need IRB approval, you want to follow ethical research practices and realize that all of your research also falls under FERPA, since we're working with students. So now let's jump into talking about survey methods, my favorite. So you want to think about what can you measure, and I suggest starting with your dream. So thinking about what you would be most excited to learn from a survey, and then unpack it to see how you could actually measure that. And in thinking about surveys, they're often critiqued as subjective appraisals, but it's really a continuum with data falling between subjective appraisals and more concrete measures. And there are ways to phrase your questions that are more subjective or more concrete, and we'll get into that in a second. But you generally, as much as you can ask more objective, more set questions, the stronger your survey will be. And then also thinking, can you combine your survey data with data from another source? So maybe you'll ask students about what they felt they learned, but then you could also merge it in with actual assessment, course grades, or actual testing of concrete knowledge, or something like that. So you might be able to combine. So now let's go back to that dream measure. We have a poll question about, if you could accurately measure anything on a survey, what would it be? So if you had a magic wand and could get an accurate measurement of what students do after college, perhaps, maybe employment or graduate school enrollment, or maybe you'd want to measure the quality of student experience. So if you're looking at those of you that answered that your primary goal was in assessing what's working or not working in your program, maybe really assessing the quality of student experience is important. Or the development of non-cognitive skills like resiliency or problem solving, emotional intelligence, or those kind of critical thinking skills. Or more concrete academic skills such as written and oral communication or following the scientific method. What would you measure if you could on a survey? As you're answering this, I would note for yourself, starting with this place of what would you ideally measure, and then figuring out what pieces of that you can actually get at in a survey. Okay. So that development of critical thinking or problem solving, or the quality of student experiences look like the top contenders here, which is great. And now we'll talk about kind of some examples of how to get at those. So I mentioned that continuum from the most subjective to more concrete knowledge. And so we're going to go through some examples of what that looks like. So the most subjective would be opinions or satisfaction. So how satisfied were you with your research mentor or supervisor? Which is important to know, but we want to get beyond just satisfaction. So the next step would be self-reported gains. So that could be self-reported learning or development. And then you're really asking the student, how much did you grow or learn from this experience? So for example, how much did you learn about graduate school options from your research mentor? You can also ask students about their specific goals or aspirations or plans. So what's the highest degree you aspire to? What do you plan to do after college? To see how those change as a result of being in your programs or being in undergraduate research. Next, we'll move to the farther down that arrow and start talking about psychosocial constructs. So these are going to be a series of questions. So instead of just asking students, do you think critically in your work, you're going to ask students a series of questions that measure critical thinking or higher order learning or self-efficacy. So this can get those of you that picked those problem solving, critical thinking, or even the soft skills, the resiliency, motivation, finding previously established and tested constructs can be a way to measure those in a reliable way. And then the next would be about asking about specific behaviors. So in self-reported gains, we're asking students to appraise how much they learned or developed, but you could also ask about how many times they did something or whether or not they did something. So for example, instead of saying, how satisfied were you with your research mentor? You can ask, how many times a week did you actually meet with the mentor? Or instead of asking just if they feel like they've developed professional communication skills, you could ask, did you present your research in a professional setting or conference? So they getting about more concrete behaviors that students can accurately report on. And then we can look at specific content knowledge. So can you test whether or not students actually know more than they did before? So this might be a concept inventory or an assessment in a course. So it's kind of an overview of the types of questions we'll be looking at. And when you're using self-reported data, it's important to use validated measures. So whether you're developing it yourself and you're going to validate it, or this is also a benefit of using previously established surveys or constructs from those surveys, is that somebody has tested them and making sure that they're validated appropriately. And then when you're using self-reported data, it doesn't mean a whole lot in and of itself. What you want to look at is a comparison between 2 points. So for example, do students who are in undergraduate research courses report greater gains than students in a traditional lab course? Or you could look at a relationship between 2 items. So do students who report presenting at a national conference report greater gains in professional communication? If you'd like more detail on how to appropriately use self-reported data, this article by Pike is a great place to start. So something I often get asked by people who are looking at assessment is, how big does my sample size have to be? Tell me how many students I need. And in general, bigger is better. But what you really want to know is, how big is big enough? And it depends on a lot of things, part of which is who you're generalizing to. So there's a link in here that we'll be sending to you afterwards with a tool where you can type in your population size and it'll give you what sample size you need. But new research has also suggested that sample size isn't everything. So for small populations, you still need a relatively high response rate to be confident about your results. But if you have a large population, more recent research has found that somewhere around 75 students, you start finding similar results as you would if you kept increasing your sample size. So the payoff to keep pushing for a larger sample size starts diminishing. So depending on how much access you have to students, how many you need, a overly generalized rule could be that around 75 students, you start getting a more accurate picture. For small populations, which we're often looking at in undergraduate research, we'll also link to some more specific information about research on small populations and tips for that. It's important to also learn from what others have done. So as on the Kerr member webpage, there's a snippet of, here on the right, there's an assessment bibliography. So you can look at what other people have done as far as assessment, what surveys they've used. If your campus participates in CERU or NESI or one of those large campus-wide surveys, you can look in there to see who else has used those and what they've done. Kerr Community is also a great place to ask what surveys people are using and what they've had good luck with. And then we're building a toolkit specifically for assessment for Kerr members, which will be coming soon. So the toolkit will include commonly used surveys, and that's what we'll give you a sneak peek of as a webinar participant, is a list and links to commonly used surveys for assessing undergraduate research. But the toolkit will also include notes on using those surveys, on participation, and previous research that has been published using those surveys. So the benefits to using pre-established surveys, these are already existing surveys that you either sign up to take and they administer for you, or surveys that have been tested and are open use and you can administer yourself, is that somebody else has gone through the time to create them, test them, validate them. And then you also either get a comparison group if this is a survey you sign up for and get a report back, or at least some benchmarking. Other people have used these surveys and published on them, so you have some idea of where other programs fall. And this may or may not be a benefit to you, but outsourcing the work, so having somebody else administer the survey and analyze it and give you back a report may be more feasible for the time commitment you have. But there's still some limits to that too. The trade-off is that the instrument is not going to be as tailored or probably as customizable as it would be if you did it yourself. So you, this is the case where you kind of have to look at those, what can you answer from the survey, instead of coming in with a question you have and then creating a survey to answer it. And then depending on how the survey is administered, you may or may not be able to match in other data, which means doing further analysis or breaking down your population. You have to see if that's something you can do if you sign up for a survey through a national organization or participating in a group survey. So there are lots of pre-existing surveys out there, and as I mentioned, we'll be giving you a more complete list, and then the toolkit will be coming out with the complete list plus some additional information. But they generally fall into a few specific categories. So there are surveys specifically for students who participate in undergraduate research, if you want to look within the undergraduate research population, or kind of compare yourself to other undergraduate research programs. There are campus-wide surveys where, for example, all seniors at your campus might take the survey, and then you can compare students who do undergraduate research or don't, or compare the number of students who do undergraduate research on your campus to other campuses. And then there are course-based surveys, so specifically designed to evaluate course-based undergraduate research. And there are, I put a few up here just as examples, and then we'll be sending a more comprehensive list. So when you're thinking about participating in a survey, here are some questions you might want to think about. Would you be able to match the data so that you can do further analysis? Is it customizable? Can you add your own questions in on something you're particularly interested in? What's the cost of participation? And how's it administered? Will you get comparison data or comparison reports? And in general, what kind of reports or analysis do you receive? And do you receive your raw data back, or who owns that data after it's administered? And that leads us to our next poll question, which is thinking about your assessment of undergraduate research and the limited time and financial resources you have at your institution. Would you rather have a pre-designed and tested survey instrument available for you to use, and that you would, so this is one that you would administer and analyze yourself? Or would you rather pay to have a survey administered and a report sent to you? Or pay less and have the survey administered for you and your unanalyzed or raw data sent back to you, so no report? Or none of the above? We'll give you another minute to finish answering that.
It looks like the results have slowed down, and I'll go ahead and publish these out for you.
Okay, so it looks like the majority of people would be interested in having a survey instrument available, and then they would do the administration and analysis themselves, or a survey administered for them, and you just get back your own raw data. Great, thank you. So we're now going to transition to talking about do-it-yourself surveys. So this would be creating your own surveys. And the benefits are you can really drill into the specifics about your program or your students, and you can change it as different needs arise. If you need to know about new information, it's more malleable. You can choose when and how it's administered, and you can connect it to other information. The limits are really the time and personnel involved in creating, testing, administering, and analyzing the survey. It can also be difficult to get a comparison group, especially off your campus. So you're probably looking at comparing to other students on your own campus. And then getting a large enough sample size can also be tricky if you're only looking within your program or your campus. So if you are going to create your own survey, you want to think about how people respond to questions so that you can write questions that they respond to accurately. So there are really 4 steps you go through. The first is comprehension. So if I asked you, what did you have for breakfast this morning? You would probably understand that. But then you have to retrieve that information. So you probably remember what you had this morning, but if I asked, what did you have for breakfast on December 2nd? You may not be able to accurately remember that. And then you have to make a judgment about the relevancy and accuracy of that information. So if I asked what you typically have for breakfast, if you're the kind of person who has oatmeal every day, that's an easy question to make a judgment on. But if you're the kind of person who has something different all the time, how do you sum up what's your average breakfast can be tricky. And then you finally have to respond to the question. So if it was multiple choice about what you had for breakfast today, and the answers were breakfast burrito, eggs, or cereal, and you had oatmeal, you don't exactly fit in that question. You have to decide, does cereal count as oatmeal? Or so giving people the accurate choices or the responses that encompass all of the possible options is important so that they can accurately respond to you. Otherwise, they have to skip the question or make something up. And you don't want that. You don't want them to have any problems along these 4 steps, because that's going to lead to data that's inaccurate. And ambiguous data equals bad data, which equals bad decision making, especially if you're looking, for those of you that are testing what's working, what's not working in your program, or trying to show the impact of something. If you're showing the impact of something and it's not accurate, you could be missing the opportunity to show something that's great for students, or you could be highlighting something that's not working and then continuing to do that. I won't have time to go into them here, but we'll send you the resources to some common survey mistakes and how to avoid them so that you can avoid getting this bad data and making bad decisions from it. But I want to point out a couple things is that students skim, or any people, when they're taking surveys, they're not paying attention to every single detail. So making the questions as concise and clear as possible is important. So for example, we had a survey that went back and forth in time frame. So some questions were about their research experience in the summer, and some were about if they had ever done certain activities. And when we tested it, we realized students weren't differentiating. They were kind of thinking of it all as just this summer, or all of it as forever. They weren't reading the detail and the timing. So we had to kind of organize the survey differently to have a section about things you've ever done and a section just about the summer. And then also thinking, what can your subjects accurately report on? So for example, you don't know what you don't know. So a pre and post test that asks students, how much do you know about the scientific method or about the research process? Your pre-test, students might score themselves pretty high because they feel good going into the summer. And then they actually do research and realize they didn't know anything about how research actually happened. And their scores might go down, not because they know less, but because their appraisal is more accurate now. So being careful to really ask them things they can accurately report on. And then also realizing that social desirability plays into how you're asking these questions. So if you ask questions where there's a clear right or wrong thing to say, or one answer that makes students really sound better, they're going to be more tempted to report on that just naturally. So I have another poll question that I would like to know kind of what your biggest pet peeves about bad survey design are. Is it when surveys are too long? When the questions are confusing or not sure how to answer them? When the responses don't apply to you? So that example, you see the responses and none of them fit what your answer would be? When there are too many open-ended questions, or not feeling like anyone's paying attention to the survey responses? What's most frustrating to you as a survey respondent? I'll give you another minute to finalize those responses.
So it looks like most people are complaining that surveys are just too long.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll talk. Oh, sorry. Okay, so surveys being too long is certainly a problem. And it looks like confusing questions. I know for me, confusing questions or responses don't apply are really frustrating for me. And so let's talk about kind of how these play out and what you can do to avoid being the perpetrator of these pet peeves. So when you're thinking about your questions, asking about behavior or specific content knowledge when possible is a way to get at more concrete questions, and questions that are often somewhat easier to answer because you know if you've done something or not, or how many times you've done something typically is fairly easy to calculate. And then asking about self-reported learning, so how much they felt like they learned from the experience or how much they've grown from the experience when it's appropriate. With your surveys, you want to pick and commit to it so that you'll have multi-year data and can compare between points in time. And then you really want to only ask for what you'll use. I'll often talk about this as the interesting versus essential test. So draft your survey with everything that you think you'll want, and then go through and figure out what's actually essential. What do you need to know? And table some of that interesting information for later. And think about what you'll do with the analysis. If there's a question on the survey that you're not sure what you'll actually do with that data, then it's probably just interesting and not essential. I often also get asked, how long can my survey be? And the answer is probably the shorter the better. But if you want a quick and dirty rule of thumb, somewhere around 10 questions, including sub-items in those. So a question might be, thinking of this summer research experience, how much did you learn in the following areas? And then you ask, professional communication, working in a team, blah, blah, blah. You have, maybe 4 sub-items to that. So somewhere around 10 questions is where most people seem to max out, including those sub-items. So that would maybe 40 items altogether organized into 10 questions would probably be about as long as most students are willing to go. But it depends on how motivated your students are, if you're allowing time for them to do this survey in a class versus asking them to do it on their own. There are a lot of factors in there too. When you're designing your survey, it's really important to test it. So we often talk about piloting, but I also see people, they just send out the survey as a pilot, but then don't really know what to do with it. So what you want to do is look at the way students are answering that pilot to see if it's what you expect. And then also something like cognitive interviews or talking with students to see how they're interpreting those questions is important. So a cognitive interview is where you ask students to read the question out loud and then talk through those steps. The 4 cognitive steps that are included earlier in this presentation. How are they understanding the question? How are they deciding how to respond? How are they choosing a particular response on there to see if they're interpreting it in ways that you intended or not? And you'll probably be surprised that the question you wrote that you thought was so clear can actually be interpreted in multiple ways, so you'll have to clarify it. The more diverse the population you're sampling is, the more you need to test it. So if you're only surveying students in undergraduate research in one particular major, you can do some testing with just those students. But if you're surveying students across campus, you need to account for students in different majors, having different terminology for things related to research, students whose primary language is in English, needing to still be able to read these questions clearly, all sorts of different factors to make sure it works for all the populations that are included in your sample. And then you can also, with your pilot data, validate it against other data. So if you're asking about self-reported learning, can you validate that against something like grades in a course or against their supervising mentor's appraisal of their learning to see if it's measuring what you think it's measuring. Also with survey design, I'd like to talk about qualitative data or open-ended questions. I call this the open-ended question trap because they're easy to write, they can be very interesting, but they take longer to answer. They're hard to analyze on the back end, and so that all builds together to result in survey fatigue and unused data. So it's a lot of that combination between it being low investment on your time and a lot of investment on the student time can lead into this just pile of qualitative data you don't know what to do with. So if there are ways to take those qualitative or open-ended questions and put them on a Likert scale or multiple choice when possible, and then just leave a box for other or for please explain in case students want to tell you more, that can make your survey quicker to respond and easier to analyze. If you are writing open-ended questions, still make them focused and concise, and think about how you're going to analyze them ahead of time. So you might go through and read all of them and code them for common themes or write down common themes from them. You might also, one example is we ask about mentoring on a Likert scale question, and then also an open-ended question, and then we'll sort just the highest and lowest on the Likert scale to read the responses to see what's going on with the kind of worst and best case mentor scenarios. So we've talked about using pre-established surveys and creating your own, but you can also combine these. So if your campus participates in a large student engagement survey, you might also do a survey of your undergraduate researchers and think about using that general information to get a big picture and some comparison data, but then drilling down into specifics with a survey you do yourself. So whether you're using a pre-established survey or creating your own, let's talk about survey administration and survey fatigue, because your students have it. As many of you noted that getting too many surveys and getting too long surveys is a prevalent problem right now. So thinking about limiting the number and length of surveys students get, many campuses now have departments that specifically coordinate when students get surveys, or kind of a clearinghouse for when these go out so they don't get bombarded all the time. And thinking about, are there ways you can collaborate? So maybe you have some questions you need answered, and so does a department for their review. Can you work together to send out one survey to students that covers both topics? Or share data so that you're not asking students about their post-graduation goals or plans over and over again in everybody's individual survey. How can you collaborate together? You also want the invitation to participate to be from someone the students knows ideally or has some buy-in with and some connection to. There's some other ways you can create buy-in is by really showing that you're going to use this data. So a lot of times people send out surveys and students don't know, like, is it worth doing this? What's the point of giving this information? So communicating to students what you've learned from past results, what have you changed as a result of previous surveys you've done, or if you haven't done them yet, what do you plan to do with the results? And how are you going to communicate these to students? So for example, we have a really high response rate of our undergraduate research survey. And what I do is I go and talk to the students before they start their undergraduate research summer program and show them what we found last year and what we've changed because of that. So for example, there's a year we found students were really struggling with writing and professional communication. So here's some things we've implemented to better support students. You can also allow class or work time for participation so that students have a time to sit down and do it. You can't require that they do it, but allowing them that space is important. Incentives are another way to combat survey fatigue. So this could be money or prizes, gift cards. If you're doing that, drawings are more effective than a lot of lower prizes. So it can get really expensive even to offer a $5 gift card to each participant. But offering a drawing for a $25 gift card gives you more impact. You can also think about altruistic incentives. So for example, we worked with a donor who was willing to contribute money to a student travel scholarship for every alumni survey that was filled out. So we told alumni, hey, you can give back to the program by completing the survey, and that helps not only inform the program, but you're helping fund a student to go to a conference this year. Also get creative. This is our staff at Cal State Monterey Bay in UROC. And say something like, if we get X number of responses, staff will wear turkey hats for a day. Our director at the time called people turkeys if he was frustrated with them. So we wore turkey hats. You could also say, Professor Quinones will dress up as Darth Vader to teach class if we get 60% respondents this week or something. All these kind of creative ways that people raise money, you can also think about using to raise participation. If somebody's willing to sit in a dunk tank for response rates, whatever it takes, you can really get creative about what students will pay attention to and what would be kind of fun or funny to get their attention to fill out this survey. So once you've convinced them to fill out the survey, what do you do with the results? The problem with self-reported data is it doesn't really mean anything in and of itself. So if you find out 78% of students report that participating in research improved their ability to communicate ideas in a professional setting, okay, is that good? Is this like a grade where 78% is a high C? Or is that great? Is that bad? It's really hard to tell. What it depends on is who you compare it to. Self-reported data doesn't usually inherently mean anything on its own. It depends on the relationship between that and your comparison. Is it better or is it worse? So you can look at other campuses, you can look within your own campus, or look within your own program, like different points in time or by varying experiences. So I have a couple examples of that. So for example, if you find out that 78% of your students compared to 80% of students at another campus felt it improved their communication, you'd say like, okay, that's pretty on par. You might look at, is there something different or not, but it's pretty close. But what if you looked at another program on your campus? So for example, if 78% of undergraduate researchers and 62% of students who did an internship said it improved their professional communication, then you might say, oh, wow, it looks like research does something different than an internship in this setting. You can look at a point in time. So if this year 78% said it improved, but last year only 75% did, you might say, oh, maybe we should look at some other points in time and see, is this an upward trend? Is something changing where this is getting better, or is that kind of normal variation in the data? Or you could break down that 78% and look within it. So what if, when you look within students who've done undergraduate research, 82% of students who had presented at a conference said it improved their professional communication, but only 74% who didn't present their research said it improved. Then that could tell you, hey, maybe what's really making the impact is being able to present findings, not just doing the research, but that presentation is what's making the difference. So you want to think about who you're comparing to and how you can use this data to really make decisions. So when you get your data, you want to compare it to other institutions if possible. So for example, my campus participates in the National Survey of Student Engagement, and we get a high impact practice report that shows us kind of how many of our students participate in undergraduate research compared to other campuses. And then we also use our data to look at some other factors about how engaged students are in our campus, whether they do research or not. You can also find a comparison group on your campus. So the best practices in this is to find similar students so you can mimic random assignment or random selection. So if you're looking at undergraduate researchers, they often are high achieving or kind of more motivated and engaged students. So you want to find a way to compare to students who are also similarly engaged and motivated. You can also look within your own population. So for example, we looked at UROC students who participated in one summer of research versus a full year-long research program to see if there were different benefits. In reporting your results, it's always important to think about who's your audience. Are you communicating this campus leadership, to lawmakers, to a grants writing agency, to a journal where you just want to build on kind of the body of knowledge about undergraduate research? Who's your audience and what do they need to know? And that'll kind of guide you in how to look at your results. So now I believe we have about 15 minutes for additional questions. If you'd like to enter them in the chat, I can answer some questions for you.
Great, we do have a couple questions in the queue. The first one has to do with the question that, some of these external assessment groups have constantly indicated that grades and results on exams are not legitimate ways to assess students. And what are your thoughts on these claims?
I don't know that I'd go as far as say they're not legitimate, but I think they're a very narrow piece of the picture. I think there's so much learning and development that you could measure beyond just a grade on a test or a GPA score. So I tend to think about GPA or grades in general, grades on particular courses, as a sliver of the picture. And that's where getting into the nuances of some of this student self-appraisal of their learning, or using some of those psychosocial constructs to test other more tricky to assess but really important measures like problem solving or like critical thinking, that are really going to tell us are these skills that are going to carry students through their education and their career, and not just is this going to boost their grade in a class.
We're getting a lot of questions regarding incentives. And so this is ranging from, I guess here's the first one. What do you think about the ethics behind kind of guilting or incentivizing students into participating? Like, does that affect the answers that you might receive?
I mean, it certainly can. If you're telling students, we need you to fill out the survey because this is how we get funding for our program, then they might just fill it out to try and, like, more of a customer satisfaction survey, like, yay, I like this program, I'll cheerlead for it. Or if they're disgruntled, they might not. But it certainly can, if you lay heavily into that could influence what they say. I think that it's a balance, because you're asking for them to give you time, and the incentive is really what you're giving them in return for that time. And whether that's feeling like they're giving back to this program and helping you make this program better for future cohorts, or it's actually a chance to win a gift card or a university sweatshirt or whatever it is they might get, that it's really an exchange in that way. They're giving you time and thought and energy to fill out the survey, and you're giving them something. So I think it's an important point to be careful what that something is. You can also, like, for example, if we're giving out an incentive, we don't make students complete the whole survey to be eligible. They have to read the consent and then agree to participate or not. And that's what puts them in the running for the drawing. So that if a student really doesn't want to complete the survey, they don't have to, and they can still be eligible. But usually we maybe have 1 or 2 students a year who go through the trouble of opening it and reading the consent and then say, like, no, I'd rather not participate.
Great. We do have a question about the best ways to integrate attention to race, class, gender, whether they're first generation, and how you incorporate that into your surveys.
That's a great question. It's actually an important point too. Like the previous question brought up, what you're saying to them can influence their responses. So if you ask about race or gender or first generation status or income, some of these more sensitive questions, at the beginning of the survey, research has actually found that can shape future responses. And if people are uncomfortable with those questions, might cause them to drop out of the survey more quickly. So usually the kind of suggested practice is to put those at the end of the survey. So people have already answered without you priming them to think about their gender or race or income or any of those. Just let them answer this survey, then ask about those. So if they're uncomfortable and they drop out, or if that primes them to think in like one specific frame, it's not influencing the rest of the survey. And there's a lot of information on kind of how to ask those questions. So a lot of older surveys will say, like, what gender are you? instead of what gender do you identify as, and then having more options besides just a male female binary, or having space for people to write it in. There's it's tricky work because what we're really trying to do is get people into categories, so we're boxing them in some ways so that we can analyze the data. But really, these social constructs like ethnicity are, anytime you're boxing them in, you're ignoring nuances in people's lived experiences. So I think the one way to handle that is asking how people identify instead of stating it as what are you, and then also creating a space. So I tend to give people categories to choose from, and then another space or a text box if they want to write in a category that I haven't provided.
Great. And so a follow-up to that is, so if you do ask that information, when you're reporting on that data, how do you evaluate those different places? Have you found some particular ways that you like to show that information to, and the relationships between the student experiences and their research?
As far as along the lines of kind of the student demographic questions?
Correct.
Or before I forget it, to not answer the question, but there's some, a center doing some really great work on kind of specifically how to make surveys more inclusive. So I'll include that in the resources that we'll send out after the webinar. Let me make a note to myself. And I think it's really important to look at the kind of diversity within the undergraduate research experience, whether you're publishing it or whether you're looking at the impact of your program, seeing what the impact is for student populations. Some previous research has found that there's actually a greater impact for traditionally underrepresented students, but that also that those students are still less likely to participate. So I think looking at the experience of those students, and then also looking at, are we reaching a diverse population of students or not? So even seeing who's responding to your survey and who's doing undergraduate research can tell you if you're really meeting that kind of full inclusion goal, or if you're serving more traditionally privileged students.
So we also have some questions about getting information from other sources, such as from the mentors. Like, do you offer a parallel mentors questionnaire to assess the development of the student skills and integrate that in with the student perceptions?
I think that's a great idea. We do that at Cal State Monterey Bay. We have students do a self-appraisal, and then mentors, they do a shorter appraisal on kind of some key components, including critical thinking, research-related skills, professional development, or academic skills. And then we can compare those. I will say getting a high enough response rate from faculty is sometimes challenging. Something that we've done is actually frame it as a feedback tool for the student. So the faculty fill out the survey and they get a report back about their student that they can share with them, so it can become a vehicle for them to do kind of an annual, almost like an annual evaluation. And we've gotten a little more faculty buy-in when there's another point to it besides just doing it as a survey, but really this is an evaluation of your student, and we suggest you talk through these things with them. Some of these national surveys also have a faculty component where you can ask students and then you can also ask faculty, and they give you a matched report. I know, I think Nessie, Saru, and Harry all have kind of faculty versions you can administer.
Great. So another question about how you are analyzing your data. If you do end up having an open-ended question in your survey, what are the best ways that you found to analyze that data?
I think going through and seeing kind of common themes. So I'll usually do kind of a quick read and see. It also depends on how many you get. If you have 2,000 responses, you're probably not going to read it's going to be a serious undertaking to read 2,000 responses. If you have 50, okay, that's readable. So for smaller surveys, what I do is I go through and read them and kind of make notes of the themes that are coming up, and you'll start quickly seeing kind of some repetition, like students are really thinking about this or concerned about this or feel like this was beneficial. And I'll make some notes on kind of what are the things that students are bringing up in this. The other way to do it is, if you have a lot of data, is to find a way to break it down. So I mentioned with mentoring, we looked at like just the mentors that were rated the highest and lowest, and then read the comments about those to see what was going on in the kind of best and worst case scenarios, and then found common themes there. There are tools that will do automatic coding. So if you're looking for something specific, so for example, we're in mentoring, we're also looking at cultural competency and cultural relevance in mentoring. So we did some automatic coding around issues related to race, class, gender, student background, and had it pull out student comments that related to those terms, and then just read those. It does take some kind of pre-work to figure out what terms you're going to search for and how to program that automatic coding. We used in vivo, if that's helpful. You can also just do a search for certain words and look at comments where that comes up, but you need a frame for what those words would be. I also actually have an undergraduate researcher whose role in the project is to read all the comments and kind of come up with summaries and key findings. So that can be a great job for a novice researcher to really dig into reading through all those comments. In presenting those, I usually find those common themes and then find a quote or an answer to a question that exemplifies that theme. So for example, a lot of students are saying, I really appreciated when my mentor talked to me about my goals, not just about the work I was doing day to day. I'd find a quote that said that nicely and use that as an example if I was reporting it to campus leadership or to in a paper or something.
Great. I think we have time for one last question. If we haven't been able to get to your questions, we will be doing a quick follow-up, and we'll make sure that you do get a response. So thank you again for attending, and I'll give this last question. It's just about your institutional practices and what your institution does to support assessment. Is it centralized, or do you have your faculty doing it? And what does that look like at your institution?
I am particularly lucky at Cal State Monterey Bay. We have a centralized institutional research office, which many campuses have. But we also, my role is the assessment and educational research associate. And so my job is actually to focus on research around undergraduate research. So it's myself, and I have 2 undergraduate researchers who research undergraduate research. Their work is very meta. And so we're able to do a lot of this work ourselves and able to support additional faculty work. Some faculty have additional assessment they're doing on course-based undergraduate research, or have collaborated with me because they're really interested in a certain question, like how does this impact post-graduation enrollment in graduate school? And then I'm able to do that work to help answer that question for them. So we're pretty well resourced here for my position to do that work to support faculty.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Heather, for this wonderful presentation, and thank you to everyone for participating and all the great questions. Again, this has been recorded, and we'll be sending out the recording, the links to the slides, and some additional resources as well that Heather alluded to throughout the presentation. And we'll be sending that out, as well as there'll be a follow-up survey that will appear after you leave the webinar, and we'll also send a link later in case you have to run off to something else right now. So thank you very much, Heather. And do you have any final comments before we exit?
No, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Bye.